At the central hearing chamber of the Galaxy Council, on the ring station called Helio Spine, Chief Archivist Mara Veyn of Earth stood alone beneath a ceiling of pale glass and relay steel. She was not there to argue about territory, trade, or fleet movement. She was there to stop the Council from taking control of the deepest historical archive Earth had ever sealed. Around her, the chamber rose in wide tiers. Delegates from 100 worlds watched through transparent partitions and floating translation fields. Their seats curved around the hall like a patient machine, and every face in that machine was turned toward the floor where Mara stood at the human lectern. The danger in the room was simple enough to name. A powerful council bloc claimed that Earth had hidden a sealed war-era archive whose contents might destabilize the present order. If that claim stood, the Council could authorize joint seizure, forced inspection, and permanent supervision of protected human records tied to the old border wars. That was the real threat. If Mara lost the opening stretch of the hearing, Earth could lose custody of the archive before the chamber had even described it honestly. She was 47, gray at the temples, narrow in build, and exact in every habit that mattered. She had spent most of her life inside secured vaults, witness rooms, memory courts, and declassification boards. Many in the chamber had expected someone softer, someone easier to pressure. Instead, they found a woman who looked as if she had measured the room before stepping into it. Behind the upper shield glass, the public gallery shimmered with press drones and licensed observers. Millions more were patched into the live relay across known space. That, more than anything, told Mara what kind of hearing this really was. If the Council had wanted caution, it would have chosen a sealed chamber and a limited record. If it had wanted truth, it would have allowed an evidentiary review first. Instead, it had chosen spectacle. At the highest tier sat presiding convener Selak, the official running the hearing and controlling the chamber. He folded 4 hands over the central rail. His voice came through the chamber field steady and measured. Chief Archivist Mara Veyn of Earth, you stand before this body to answer a narrow and urgent question. Has Earth concealed, beyond lawful review, materials from the late strategic war, period whose release or misuse could threaten present peace? Mara kept her gaze level. Earth has preserved sealed records under treaty authority and war memory protection statutes recognized by this Council. Earth denies that those records constitute a hidden military cache or unlawful destabilization asset. The phrasing had been chosen with care. Not hidden military cache. Not unlawful destabilization asset. She gave him no easy slogan. Councillor Thalen Merrick's rose from the right flank, where the Hadron block and its aligned delegates sat in an arc of blue metal seats. He was the most dangerous pressure in the room, the one pushing hardest for seizure. Tall, silver-eyed, and unervingly composed, Merrick's did not waste motion. He was one of the most disciplined political operators in Council space, a man famous for making coercion sound like civic duty. Earth denies the obvious by changing the label. Merrick said, the issue is not whether your species has paperwork. The issue is that Earth has withheld a body of strategic material from neutral scrutiny while invoking the language of grief and memorial protection. That archive has been sealed for decades. Access has been restricted even from recognized Council monitors. Entire record families are missing from public historical chains. Why? To preserve integrity, Mara said. A mild stir moved through the galleries. Merrick's tilted his head, inviting her to say more and perhaps say too much. Integrity, he repeated, an admirable word. Yet public registry shows erased reference trees, dead file links, redirected index paths, and duplicate conflict maps bearing contradictory relief timelines. Are we to believe all of this was done in service of honesty? Public registry shows derivative copies, Mara said, not source holdings. Selak leaned forward. Then let us begin there. Clarify the distinction. Mara did not look toward Earth staff rail, though she knew her legal team and transmission specialists were feeding her live notes through the private display behind her wrist cuff. She already knew what had to be said first. During the final years of the border wars, she said, multiple signatory powers created protected war memory repositories. The goal was not concealment for gain. The goal was preservation of the original chain. Raw records were isolated from political editing, retaliatory tampering, and post-war revision during Reconstruction. Some archives were later opened. Some were fragmented by collapse. Earth kept its custody intact. Maritz gave a thin smile. He did not miss the opening. And among those who conveniently lost access, we are asked to trust the only intact vault left in human hands. There it was. The first frame. Not Earth protected the last complete record. Earth monopolized it. Mara let the silence breathe for one beat. You are not asking whether Earth preserved records, she said. You're asking whether Earth should still be allowed to decide what those records are. That sharpened the room. Several delegates shifted. The translation haze thickened as dozens of private channels opened and closed. The argument was no longer about missing files alone. It had become a fight over who was allowed to define the past. Selak tapped a finger to the rail. Then answer that directly. Is the sealed human archive, in your judgment, solely memorial in nature? No, Mara said. The reaction came openly. Noise broke across the tiers, clipped and sudden. Merrick's did not move, but his eyes brightened. It is historical, Mara said. Legal, operational, humanitarian, diplomatic. It includes loss registries, command traffic, relief scheduling, evacuation denials, resource diversions, and authenticated witness materials. It is not solely memorial. Merrick spread one hand. There, at last. It is also not a weapons reserve, Mara said. Not a dormant command lattice. Not a buried strategic machine. If this body intends to force a seizure on the assumption that Earth holds a hidden military relic, it is proceeding under a false description. A second bell cut through the murmur. Selak restored order with visible effort. Counselor Ilya Run of the Civic Mediation Circle rose from the center tiers. Run was not as openly aggressive as Merrick's. She was the soft voice in the room, the one who made surrender sound reasonable. Where Merrick's pressed like a blade, Rin moved like cloth over stone. Chief Archivist, Rin said, let us set aside the word weapon. Many destabilizing materials are not weapons in the narrow sense. A sealed archive containing operational denials, strategic allocations, and wartime triage decisions involving still living polities could trigger reprisals, market collapse, civil fractures, and interspecies violence. Surely Earth understands that unilateral custody over such material is itself a form of power. Mara turned slightly toward her. Yes, Earth understands that better than most. Rin's tone remained gentle. Then perhaps we are close to agreement. No, Mara thought. We are close to the trap becoming polite. Selak signaled. The record grid. Above the chamber floor, 3 suspended panes ignited with evidence summaries already arranged for public viewing. Mara saw the sequence at once. Registry anomalies first. Public index gaps second. Restricted transit manifests third. Whoever had built the presentation wanted the narrative to feel inevitable before the real argument even began. Merrick's stepped into the center light. For the record, he said, my office submits consolidated proof that Earth's sealed holdings include undocumented wartime, routing records tied to at least 9 vanished relief corridors, 14 conflict-era command signatures no longer visible in Council history sets, and a protected subindex designated only by pre-standard human war code. Earth refuses external verification. Earth refuses partial audit. Earth refuses supervised transfer. We therefore move for provisional custodial intervention pending full review. The chamber darkened around the evidence panes. The words provisional custodial intervention echoed harder than any shouted accusation could have. Mara saw the public translation stream catch them and spread. Custody. Intervention. A seizure in all but name. Selak inclined his head toward her. Earth may answer. Mara looked up at the panes. Data could always be made to accuse, especially when the order of presentation had already chosen the story. She had expected aggression, but not this early push for transfer. Good, she thought. Now I know how frightened they are. She let her hands rest flat on the lectern edge. Her pulse was steady. Earth will answer in full, she said. But first let the record show that this chamber was never convened to discover what the archive is. It was convened to take it. No one spoke. Merrick's expression did not change, but the stillness around him did. For the first time that morning, Mara felt him measuring her rather than presenting her. That is a dramatic claim, Selak said. It is a procedural one, Mara replied. Because the outcome your block seeks was pre-built before evidence review began. Merrick's did not let the pause go unused. This is a diversion. No, Mara said. This is the floor plan of the trap. The gallery noise surged again. Press drones repositioned in a glittering cloud. Mara raised her wrist and activated a narrow private relay. On Earth's staff rail, her legal counsel sent the packet she had requested. Presiding convener, Mara said, Earth requests that the chamber logs preserve the original scheduling matrix, presentation authorization chain, and media. Release order that produced today's hearing format. That landed harder than accusation because it sounded administrative. Administrative facts frightened political bodies more than outrage ever could. Selak hesitated. Rin stepped in before the silence grew worse. Emergency procedure often requires sequencing adjustments. Then why was the intervention motion drafted before the evidence conference? Mara asked. Rin did not answer at once. That pause was enough. Mara continued. Earth received notice of the provisional seizure language after your offices had already circulated media guidance for terminology tied to concealed strategic cache. The phrase was selected before argument began. Merrick's voice cooled. Because the risk is obvious. Because the narrative was selected, Mara said. Selak's four hands moved again over the rail. A tell now, not poise but containment. This body will not descend into performance. Return to the central matter. If Earth disputes the framing of the archive, identify its lawful classification and explain why neutral review has been denied for so long. The sealed archive, Mara said, is classified as a protected continuity repository established under late war preservation authority and ratified by post-war memory accords this council itself recognized. Its primary function is source integrity. Not political convenience. Not historical curation. Source integrity. Merrick's folded his hands behind his back. The last refuge of every species that wants to hide behind procedure is to call custody sacred. Procedure is what remains when memory becomes profitable, Mara said. Selak made a low sound of impatience. Define source integrity for the chamber. An untouched chain. Original routing. Original timestamps. Original witness authentication. Original command structures. No retroactive smoothing. No merit summaries. No omission by embarrassment, convenience, or alliance pressure, Rin said. And yet Earth alone holds this intact. Not by design, Mara replied. By endurance. Merrick's seized on it at once. Then you admit others lost theirs. Yes, Mara said. Some lost theirs in collapse. Some through neglect. Some through political revision during Reconstruction. Some through what their caretakers later called sanitization. The word fell like a small hard object into deep water. Merrick's face remained unreadable, but several delegates on the outer tiers went still. The argument had shifted again, this time from custody to what had happened to other records after the war. Chief Archivist, Selak said carefully, are you accusing member polities of altering protected war records? I am stating a known historical risk, which is the precise reason. Protected repositories were created, then release yours to independent custody, Rin said at once. If Earth's concern is preservation rather than power, the obvious remedy is distributed stewardship under Council seal. No one species should retain unilateral control over records of this consequence. To whom? Mara asked. Rin blinked once. To a neutral archival authority. There is no neutral archival authority in this chamber, Mara said. There is only a central authority with political obligations. That drew a sharp intake of sound from the upper tiers. Rin's expression tightened for the first time. You insult this institution. No, Mara said. I define it correctly. Selak signaled another evidence pane. This one displayed transit logs from the late war era, rendered in simplified form for public viewing. Several routes were marked in amber, then blacked out at key intersections. Beside them floated decrypted tags pulled from old human manifest classes. Merrick's voice turned exact. He wanted to pull the room back to safer ground. Let us then discuss these. 9 relief corridors whose final routing data are sealed in your archive. Not ask why this chamber is suddenly desperate to define it as a threat. Selak's tone hardened. Chief Archivist, this chamber will not indulge repeated insinuation. If you contend the danger lies elsewhere, say where. The danger, Mara said, is not that Earth preserved a military relic. The danger is that some people in this chamber know exactly what kind of archive this is and need the public to believe it is something else. This time the outcry was immediate and broad. Translation fields flared bright across the tiers. Several delegates rose halfway from their seats before chamber marshals signaled them down. Selak struck the rail for order. Name no person without evidence. I have named no person, Mara said. Merrick's calm finally sharpened into visible irritation. Then provide the evidence for your insinuation or withdraw it. Mara touched her wrist display once. A small inset opened on the leftmost pane. It contained the authorization chain for the day's public evidence deck. Selak frowned. That is a compilation log. Yes. Read the licensing path, Mara said. The chamber clerks zoomed the chain for public clarity. The request had originated with Merrick's office. The second review had passed through Wren's Mediation Bureau. The third authorization, however, routed through historical harmonization, a quiet central office whose public role was to standardize educational and civic record sets across member worlds. No one answered. Wren spoke first, and that told Mara more than any denial could have. Harmonization support is routine when public history terms intersect with legal proceedings. Then why was Earth not informed? Wren's voice remained soft. Because the hearing concerns your archive, not your comfort. There, the first real glimpse under the silk. Mara pressed on. Why did that bureau receive priority access to anomaly summaries before Earth? The clerk desk conferred in fast, low tones. Merrick's cut in at once. Chief Archivist, enough. You are wandering through process minutiae because your government cannot justify secrecy. No, Mara said. I am showing this chamber that before anyone heard evidence, the offices most invested in controlling historical language had already helped define Earth's archive as a danger. For the first time that morning, Merrick's abandoned the posture of patient statesman. Because it may be one, or because you already know it is not the kind of archive you told the public it was. Silence cracked across the hall. Selak spoke slowly. Chief, Archivist Mara Veyn, you have implied procedural manipulation, narrative pre-selection, and institutional bias. This chamber grants you one final opportunity before intervention motion proceeds. State clearly what Earth claims this archive contains that justifies decades of extraordinary control. Mara took one breath. The archive contains the uncompressed historical source chain for a period the modern council has never described honestly. Loaded a pre-authorized visual shell. Nothing raw. Nothing traceable to still vulnerable descendant settlements. Only structure. You asked what kind of archive this is, she said. Earth will show the topographic shell of the repository. Not page content. Not witness identity. Not unsecured routing. Structure. The chamber lights lowered. Above the floor, a dark sphere unfolded into an intricate branching lattice of file families, timestamp streams, cross-authentication nodes, jurisdiction seals, and event clusters. It was beautiful in the severe way only preserved complexity could be. A murmur spread through the hall. The first thing visible to every observer was scale. The second was category. Not tactical lattice. Not weapons reserve. Not dormant command core. Loss registry. Relief arbitration. Evacuation triage. Civilian corridor denials. Supply diversion. Intergovernmental command conflict. Witness custody. Descendant settlement exposure. Reconstruction suppression. Historical review blocks. This, Mara said, is the top-level shell of Earth Continuity Archive 9. Selak stared up at it. There are far more humanitarian branches than were disclosed in public summary. Because public summary was not written to describe the archive accurately, Mara said. Merrick's turned sharply. You are exploiting protected category labels to sentimentalize control. No, Mara said. I am correcting your military framing with the archive's own architecture. She rotated the shell slowly. Thread lines glowed between categories, showing how witness statements linked to transit logs, how command disputes linked to relief timing, and how civilian loss records linked to denied corridor access. Counselor Vesh of the Outer Harbors Federation spoke from the rear tiers. Those are integrated chains. Yes, Mara said. Cross-corroborated? When possible. How many non-human source signatures are in the shell? Thousands. That mattered. It broke the easiest propaganda line. The archive was not merely what humans said had happened to humans. Merrick's stepped in before the room could absorb too much. A shell proves only categorization. Any state can build an accusatory scaffold. This tells us nothing of authenticity. Mara nodded once. Correct. Which is why shell alone is not proof. It is classification. Then it changes nothing. It changes your description, Mara said. He was ready for that. Very well. I revised the description. Earth controls a vast, unreviewed, cross-jurisdictional war and post-war archive, whose disclosure could destabilize current member governments. Rin stepped in smoothly, which is precisely why a neutral custodial structure is needed. Mara turned slightly toward the center tiers. To whom would you assign that? Custody, Council. Rin's answer came prepared. To a composite historical stewardship board under emergency seal. Drawn for what offices? Archival, legal, and reconciliation branches. Would historical harmonization sit on that board? Rin's face remained calm, if relevant. Mara touched her lectern again. The metadata trace Earth's analyst had authenticated appeared beside the shell map. Descriptor modeling. Phrase alignment. Public label testing. The list of rejected military descriptors glowed in cold text. This trace, Mara said, shows that before the hearing reopened, offices connected to public history language tested multiple military labels for the archive. Every available phrase assumed a hidden war asset. None described the humanitarian and legal branches now visible to this chamber. Instantly. Communications offices test descriptors as a matter of standard procedure. Yes, Mara said, but they usually test descriptors after classification is established. Not before. Selak's voice cut across them. Can chamber records confirm the sequence? The clerk desk conferred. One answered, sequence confirmed. A current passed through the chamber. Small but real. Doubt. Mara pressed the advantage while existed. The issue before this body is no longer simple, she said. The archive cannot honestly be described as a hidden military cache. It is a protected continuity repository containing integrated legal, humanitarian, and operational records tied to a period of war the public narrative has simplified beyond recognition. Merrick's response came cold and surgical. Simplified does not mean false. No, Mara said. It means partial. Every history is partial. Not every history hides its omissions behind seizure orders. Selak struck for order. Merrick's changed direction. He could feel the room slipping. Chief Archivist, if your case rests on moral distinction rather than authenticity, let us be direct. Why did Earth keep this structure sealed for so long, if not to preserve leverage? There it was. Because broken records are easy to deny, Mara said. Because during Reconstruction, too many governments were rebuilding legitimacy on narrowed versions of the war. Because partial release without full chain would have produced exactly what this hearing has already attempted: reframing, abstraction, and reburial. And because Earth spent decades recovering cross-signatures from ruined systems so that when the archive entered daylight, it could survive the first attack. Selak's expression hardened. This body still requires a basis for action. You have shown classification structure and possible pre-framing. You have not yet shown evidence sufficient to overturn the intervention concern. Mara selected the next layer. The sphere above the chamber contracted until only one branch remained lit. Relief arbitration. From spread 9 corridors, each marked by date bands and outcome states. Most ended in coded closure. 3 were annotated with descendant risk blocks. 1, at the center, carried an old council routing signature still used in ceremonial histories to symbolize wartime cooperation. These 9 corridors, Mara said, are among the routes cited by the intervention motion as evidence that Earth concealed strategic movement data. I will clarify what the shell alone cannot. She let the central route brighten. They were relief corridors. The words changed the room more than any accusation had. Merrick's moved fast. Relief corridors and war zones can still conceal military transfer. Yes, Mara said, which is why the archive binds them to civilian distribution manifests, triage boards, denial codes, and witness confirmation. You are still asserting, not proving. She knew that. So did everyone else. Vesh of the Outer Harbors Federation spoke again. How many of the 9 routes ended in unresolved casualty mass events? All 9, Mara said. That detonated into open sound. Selak pounded for order. Rin stood, then sat again. The chamber understood that the issue had changed again. This was no longer about hidden military logistics. It was about who had been allowed to describe old loss. Merrick's composure held, but his voice dropped half a tone. This chamber should move to seal broadcast immediately. Selak looked down. On what grounds? On grounds that unverified atrocity implication directed at current member lineages may trigger system-level unrest. There it was. Not safety of data. Safety of legitimacy. Mara Veyn. You made this hearing public before Earth spoke. If the chamber now fears the public nature of the subject, it should explain why. Selak did not answer. Rin tried instead. Because there is a difference between discussing custodial policy and transmitting unresolved accusations that may inflame ancient grievances. Mara turned toward her. Then the chamber should not have branded the archive a hidden war thread in public before learning what it contained. The room was slipping from control. Mara had one move left before the chamber decided whether to cut the feed or let her continue. Presiding convener, she said, Earth will not release raw documents into a live public feed. But Earth is prepared to present a single, authenticated index cluster proving that one of these corridors was categorized internally as a relief denial case, not a military routing case. Merrick said, absolutely not. Selak looked at him with visible irritation. Counselor, you do not preside. Merrick did not apologize. 1 cluster becomes 3. 3 becomes an evidentiary collapse conducted in front of 1 million agitated spectators. Mara answered before Selak could restore process. Or 1 cluster becomes enough to prove that this hearing has misdescribed the archive from the beginning. Selak weighed the room, then the risk. Limited cluster. Noto witness identities. No descendant settlement exposure. No live coordinates. Chamber clerks will verify every field shown. Merrick closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Mara touched the lectern. Earth's secure channel transferred the prepared cluster into the chamber buffer. Clerk fields swarmed over it. Signature chains lit green one after another. The document that appeared above the floor was brutally plain. Route designation. Relief priority status. Civilian dependency count. Diversion request. Denial authority. Reason code. Projected survivability after delay. The hall did not erupt at once. The first reaction was worse. It froze. Projected survivability after delay. 9%. Then the denial authority field sharpened. Not Earth. Not a vanished militia. Not an unknown rogue flotilla. A council wartime command board. Merrick spoke into the silence like a man walking onto thin ice because it was the only ground left. 1 routed board decision proves nothing of broad policy. Mara looked at him. It proves the route was not a hidden human military channel. That is not the same as proving malicious historical concealment. No, Mara said. It is not. But it was enough. Enough to puncture the first lie. Selak's face had gone pale beneath its pattern markings. This chamber will enter controlled evidentiary mode. Merrick snapped, seal the feed. And there was, at last, in naked form. Mara spoke over him. The chamber may do as it chooses. But the public has now seen that the archive you called a war threat includes denied relief records bearing council command authority. Veyn stood slowly. Her calm had not vanished, but it had changed shape. Chief Archivist Veyn, no one here denies that war involved harsh triage. If your implication is that difficult decisions were made under impossible scarcity, that is tragedy, not scandal. Mara turned to face her fully. That depends, she said, on what happened next. The room heard the sentence before it understood where she was taking it. Selak called the chamber into controlled evidentiary mode. The public feed narrowed to procedural audio and fixed room view, enough to avoid the charge of full blackout while starving commentators of fresh visuals. They had seen the shell. They had seen the pre-framing. They had seen a denied relief route labeled as a threat in the seizure motion. The hearing could no longer return to where it began. Controlled evidentiary mode transformed the chamber without emptying it. The public could still hear the procedural spine and see the delegates seated in their places, but the floating screens were masked from open relay. Inside the hall, however, every delegate could now view authenticated materials through private field strips. The effect was intimate and more dangerous than spectacle. Selak kept his voice formal out of habit, though the habit was fraying. The chamber recognizes that the initial intervention description may have been incomplete. That does not settle the question of custody, nor does it validate any broader accusation of deliberate post-war falsification. Chief Archivist Veyn, you indicated that what followed matters. Clarify. What followed, Mara said, was not merely memory. It was administration. Run gave a small, guarded tilt of the head. Explain that distinction. Memory can fail by grief, distance, or decay. Administration fails by choice. She selected another cluster from the archive shell. This one sat under historical review blocks, linked outward to relief routing, reconstruction directives, educational templates, and intergovernmental record standards. Delegates saw only category shells and provenance summaries, not raw pages. These are not battlefield records, Mara said. They're post-war handling records. Merrick folded his hands again, rebuilding patience around himself. Handling records assembled by Earth. Cross-custodian handling records, Mara corrected. Some recovered from abandoned ministry vaults. Some from court annex servers. Some from dead local archives. Some from human diplomatic caches. They do not all originate with Earth. Selak interrupted before the exchange could harden into repetition. Show the chamber one example of what you mean by post-war handling. Mara displayed a stripped comparison table. On one side, a relief event as represented in current council history sets. On the other, the event's original administrative classification as preserved in the archive shell. Public history described a logistical interruption during late war dispersal. Original classification identified a denied relief. Continuation following strategic reprioritization. Public history listed population loss as unverified displacement. Original classification listed projected mass mortality after supply withdrawal. The stillness in the chamber deepened. Counselor Dar OSS from the agrarian world spoke for the first time. You were telling us revision occurred through wording. Yes, Mara said. Bryn stepped in with renewed force. All reconstructed histories compress language. In every civilization, post-war records are standardized for coherence. The existence of terminology drift does not establish malicious concealment. Mara nodded once. Agreed. Terminology drift alone does not. Then what does? Mara opened a second layer. Review requests. Redaction recommendations. Educational alignment notes. Distribution restrictions. The dates spanned almost 2 decades after the war. This, she said, is not drift. This is maintenance. Merrick struck before the room could absorb it. Maintenance of civic order. Every government does it after catastrophe. Civil peace requires shared terms. Mara turned toward him. Shared terms are not the issue. What is? whether shared terms were used to erase responsibility. Selak looked from one field to another. Can you connect these maintenance records directly to currently surviving council offices? Yes, Mara said. Merrick's did not wait. Then submit them under seal and cease performing implication. I intend to submit them, but not into a whole where summary boards can digest them into another acceptable abstraction. Selak's voice rose slightly. You do not dictate chamber process. No, Mara said, but Earth does dictate whether its archive enters a process designed to rename it. The room nearly tore open again. This is not proof that every current official shares culpability, she said. It is proof that the offices involved in managing post-war historical language are not detached from the decision chains whose consequences were softened. The lineage survives. Wren still try to hold the center. Administrative lineage proves continuity of bureaucracy, not continuity of guilt. Correct, Mara said, which is why guilt is not my primary claim. Selak fixed his gaze on her. Then state your primary claim clearly. My primary claim is that this chamber was pushed towards seizing the human archive because some of the institutions most exposed by its content still sit too close to the official memory of the war. Merrick said, that is still accusation. It is explanation. He looked at Selak. Presiding convener, if you permit this hearing to become an indictment of the post-war order, every current stabilization agreement may be touched by speculative grievance. Trade lines, border settlements, reparations, ceilings, memorial compacts, all of it. He was not wrong. That was what made him dangerous. He was never merely defending himself. He was defending the scaffolding built over old wounds, and much of that scaffolding really did hold civilization together. Selak asked the question no one else wanted to voice. If the chamber accepts even provisional plausibility of your claim, what exactly does Earth want? Not vengeance, Mara said. Not open archive flood. Not collapse. Merrick's laughed softly once. Then what? Verification. The word sounded modest. It was not. A protected, multi-jurisdictional evidentiary process with distributed source mirrors, independent chain auditors, descendant claimant representation, and no single office empowered to rewrite summary language before review. Wren said, you are describing a parallel historical authority. I am describing a process no current authority can quietly digest. Selak adjourned for limited internal consultation, but this time no one pretended the pause was administrative. Delegates rose into knots of whispered crisis. Harmonization officials requested protected counsel. Smaller polities with ancestral loss claims began filing immediate standing motions. The second consultation lasted 40 minutes and remade the chamber's alliances in plain sight. By the time the delegates returned to their places, the old block lines still existed, but they no longer aligned cleanly with the argument that had opened the day. Some feared the archive. Some feared the past inside it. Some feared what their voters would ask if the hearing ended with the council shielding itself. Selak resumed with a voice stripped of earlier confidence. Several motions are now before the chamber. One seeks immediate seal and transfer of the archive. One seeks suspension of all intervention pending evidentiary review. One seeks appointment of a provisional historical verification panel. Before these are heard, the chair recognizes a request for witness confrontation from Earth. Merrick spoke instantly. Denied. We are not turning this into a tribunal of selective ghosts. It is not selective, Mara said. It is precise. Whom does Earth seek to confront? Selak asked. Director Sorrel Anvek, current head of historical harmonization. The chamber stirred. Wren rose. Director Anvek oversees curricular alignment and public continuity frameworks. She is not a wartime official. Correct, Mara said. She is a post-war custodian. A side partition opened. Sorrel Anvek stepped into the lower witness arc wearing the dark neutral attire of Central. Civil administration. She was older than Mara by perhaps a decade, fine-boned, almost delicate, with the calm face of someone accustomed to speaking in polished ambiguity to audiences that rarely challenge her definitions. She placed one hand on the witness rail and submitted to identity verification without comment. Selak addressed her. Director Anvek. The chamber asks only that you answer narrowly and truthfully to matters within your office's authority. Anvek inclined her head. Of course. Mara began gently. Director, does historical harmonization maintain stewardship over educational and civic summary language tied to late border war events? Yes. Does your office inherit earlier standardization responsibilities from previous Reconstruction-era agencies? It inherits some mandates and archives, yes. Does it review terminology used in public council historical distributions? Yes. Did your office participate in preparing language options for today's hearing materials? Mvek looked at Selak, then back at Mara. It reviewed terminology requests, yes. Before or after the archive was accurately classified in chamber. Terminology review often precedes final classification language when public safety communication is involved. Did any tested descriptor accurately reflect the humanitarian and legal branches now shown in the archive shell? Envek paused. Not in the preliminary models, no. The answer rippled outward. Mara continued. Why not? Envek kept her tone composed. Because the requests submitted to our office framed the matter as a potential strategic threat requiring concise public labeling. We respond to the requesting office's briefing. Merrick's interjected. There, your bureau processed an external concern. Nothing more. Mara did not look at him. Director, does your office also maintain legacy review memos regarding post-war terminology alignment tied to relief events and civic loss narratives? Her first real hesitation came then. It maintains many legacy records. Answer the question. Yes. Has your office, or its predecessor lineages, recommended replacing direct denial phrasing with broader instability or dispersal terminology in public educational distribution? Anvek chose her words as if each had a blade hidden inside it. In the post-war period, many governments faced extreme pressures. Language was standardized to reduce retaliatory grievance spirals. Was direct responsibility softened? Sometimes direct language was deferred pending wider reconciliation. Mara struck before the explanation could turn noble. How long is deferment in your office, Director? Envek looked back at her. That depends on social conditions. 10 years. In some cases. 20. In exceptional cases. 3 generations. No answer. Mara let it stand. Then she opened the next prepared summary, a lineage chart no more sensational than a family tree. Wartime Review Board. Reconstruction Language Office. Civic Continuity Bureau. Historical Harmonization. Staff Transitions. Charter Transfers. Functional Inheritance. Director, Mara said, does your current office hold charter inheritance from the post-war bodies that manage distribution language around denied relief events? Yes. Does it also possess review authority over whether route-specific responsibility remains visible in standard public historical sets? Yes, she said. Mara opened a stripped audit note from Anvek's office dated 6 years earlier. The note concerned a petition by descendant groups requesting restoration of route-specific accountability language in 3 public historical modules. Restoration not advised, pending broader inter-system sensitivities and risk of concentrated grievance revival. Envek went very still. Did your office recommend against restoring route-specific accountability language in public historical modules 6 years ago? Mara asked. Envek answered carefully. My office recommended caution. Did it recommend restoration? No. Why? Because descendant tensions in the affected transit zones remained fragile. Mara took one step closer to the witness arc. Or because once route-specific accountability returned to public language, historians and claimants might follow it backward into the original denial chains. Thanks, dude. Chief Archivist. That is argument, not question. Selak said nothing. He wanted the answer. Anvek looked from Mara to the presiding tier and back again. Her voice changed when she finally spoke. It became less polished and more real. Because some wounds, once named in full, do not stop at history, she said. They move into law, property, legitimacy, compensation, and blame. They tear apart settlements built to stop the next war. My office exists to prevent permanent civilization from living in its own open scars. It was the best defense anyone had offered all day. And because it was partly true, it was dangerous. Mara respected it enough to answer honestly. And in preventing civilization from living in its scars, did your office help teach it to look away from them? Anvek's gaze held. Sometimes looking away keeps children alive. And sometimes looking away teaches institutions that the dead can be reorganized into acceptable silence. Then a voice came from the far left tiers. Small compared to Merrick's and Run, and rarely heard in major sessions. Counselor Turinja of the Loom Descendant Worlds, whose people had lost 2 corridor systems during the late war. If route-specific responsibility was deferred, Ja asked, quietly, who decided when our dead became safe enough to name? Anvek turned toward him. She had no answer that would not sound obscene. Selak broke the silence. Director Anvek, one final question. Did your office, at any point, know that Earth maintained a more complete source chain than public history reflected? Anvek closed her eyes once. Yes, she said. The chamber broke. Maris was on his feet immediately. Known in what sense? Known as a probability, Anvek said. Not a reviewed certainty. Mara spoke over him. Known enough to make today's seizure framing urgent. That is your conclusion, Merrick snapped. Yes, Mara said. And yours too. That is why your block moved custody before classification. Selak pounded the rail to restore order. It took several strikes. When the noise finally thinned, he did something Mara had not expected. He looked directly at Anvek and asked, did any office under your authority advise that public handling of the human archive should emphasize strategic risk rather than historical complexity? Anvek hesitated. That was answer enough. But she gave the rest anyway. Yes. Mara did not smile. There was no pleasure in it. Only the heavy confirmation of a thing she had carried too long. The archive had not been targeted because it was unknowable. It had been targeted because it was legible. Merrick's waited until the chamber had stopped reacting to Anvek's testimony and the new motions had been formally logged. Then he asked Selak for direct response time. The Hadron counselor stepped into the center light. Let us be adults, he said. The chamber has heard enough to know that post-war language was managed, that some offices softened responsibility in public historical distribution, and that Earth preserved a more complete source chain than the modern record contains. None of this is ideal. None of it is pretty, but ugly truth and destabilizing truth are not the same. He turned, taking in the full arc of delegates. Those who governed after the border wars inherited systems on the verge of permanent fracture. Freight collapse, refugee tides, food failures, border militias, ritual revenge economies, successor claims on burned worlds. Everyone in this room benefits from the fact that Reconstruction leaders chose closure over endless recursive blame. A number of delegates, especially from the commercial blocks, went still in the way people do when a speaker begins naming the argument they already wanted. Permission to believe. Merrick's continued. Yes, records were broadened. Yes, some route-specific responsibilities were deferred. Yes, harmonization became a shield as well as a tool. But the chamber must ask the only question that matters today. Are we here to preserve stability or to indulge a human performance of righteous historical release timed exactly to protect human custody? Ren added her voice from the center tier, not to attack Mara now, but to widen Merrick's bridge. No one here is defending cruelty, she said. The question is whether unveiling unprocessed, route-specific blame across living descendant networks will heal the dead or simply produce new living casualties. The Council cannot govern by moral shock alone. Selak turned to Mara. Chief Archivist Veyn. Respond. Mara did not move for 2 full seconds. I agree with more of that argument than either of you expects, she said. That drew instant attention because it broke the easy conflict line. The post-war order did prevent wider collapse. Reconstruction leaders faced impossible conditions. Triage language may, in some places, have prevented immediate retaliatory wars. I do not deny that. Earth does not deny that. The archive does not deny that. Merrick's expression shifted, cautious now. Rin watched without blinking. But, Mara said, and the chamber seemed to contract around the word. War triage is one question. Post-war concealment is another. She brought up a final cluster. 3 linked elements in stripped form. A wartime denial board decision. A reconstruccionera sa mari revision. A recent internal guidance note concerning descendant claim risks if route attribution were restored. 3 decades apart. One thread. A quiet reaction moved through the room. Everyone could see what she meant now. This was no longer one hard choice made under fire. It was a pattern carried forward long after the fire ended. Difficult wartime decisions can be argued, Mara said. People may debate necessity, scarcity, and command burden. What cannot be defended is this. Not a hard choice made in fire. A long choice made in safety. She highlighted the recent guidance note. The chamber saw the date. It was not ancient. It was from the present order. After the war ended, she said, after markets recovered, after borders stabilized, after children were raised under the promise that the worst had passed, institutions still chose to keep route-specific accountability suppressed because truth threatened legitimacy. Merrick's answered at once. Because unresolved truth threatened peace. Mara turned toward him. No, because truth threatened comfort first. That line traveled through the hall like current. Merrick's came at her with the last honest defense he had left. And what do you propose? A full moral release? A galaxy of lawsuits, reprisals, succession claims, memorial militarizations? You speak as if truth arrives clean. It does not. It arrives with knives. Mara nodded. Yes, it does. The answer unsettled him more than denial would have. She stepped away from the lectern for the first time all day. I'm not asking this chamber to flood open every wound, she said. I'm asking it to stop pretending the people who kept the wounds unnamed should also control the only intact chain that proves where they came from. Selak's face was unreadable now. Rin looked stricken, not because she had lost, but because she could see the shape of the loss. Mara continued. Earth did not preserve this archive to become priest of everyone's grief. Earth preserved it because every other intact chain became vulnerable to power, collapse, or cleanup. And this morning, when the chamber tried to seize the archive under military framing, it proved the vulnerability had not ended. It had merely become polite. What should happen next? Selak asked. Here was the real endgame. Earth will not surrender Continuity Archive 9 to Council custody, Mara said. But Earth will not keep it as solitary property either. Earth proposes an independent verification framework with 5 conditions. She lifted one finger. First, source custody remains physically distributed, with the intact human chain mirrored into sealed audit nodes that no single government or bureau can edit. Second, chain auditors are selected from jurisdictions with no direct administrative inheritance from wartime review, reconstruction language control, or current harmonization offices. Third, descendant claimant councils from affected worlds receive standing representation in review of route-specific responsibility language. Fourth, public historical revisions cannot be issued as summary language until source disputes and provenance objections are logged alongside them in permanent record. Fifth, no office involved in today's pre-classification military framing may hold supervisory power over the process. The chamber vibrated with whispered translation. This was not vengeance. It was structure. Rin found her voice first. That would create a historical authority parallel to the council. It would create a verification authority the council does not control. Mara said. Merrick spoke softly, more dangerous now than when loud. And if the chamber refuses? Mara met his gaze. Then the chamber will have confirmed everything Earth feared when it kept the archive sealed. A long silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Turin Ja of the Loom descendant world stood and said, My delegation supports immediate suspension of all seizure motions and endorses the verification framework as the basis for negotiation. Another light came on, then another. Small apologies first. Worlds with named dead, missing routes, or inherited memorial disputes. The outer arcs began to align. Commercial blocks hesitated. They feared instability, but they feared public complicity more. Vesh of the Outer Harbors Federation requested amended support conditioned on staged release. Agrarian worlds followed. Even some central systems began to peel away from Merrick's, not out of moral courage alone, but because he had lost the ability to present seizure as prudent neutrality. Rin looked towards Selak. He looked back at her, and Mara understood in that glance that both of them knew the center had broken. Merrick's made one final attempt. Presiding convener, he said, before the chamber rushes into sentiment, I request direct testimony from a wartime command witness able to speak to triage necessity. Let the room remember the conditions under which these choices were made. He wanted complexity back. Tragic necessity. Hard context. Selak considered it, then nodded once. Granted, if such a witness is available in scope. Mara did not object. She had no interest in flattening history into villains and saints. A side witness gate opened again, and an old figure entered leaning on a carbon cane. Commander Halden Rowe, once a logistics adjudicator attached to interspecies relief boards in the Final War years. He had testified in closed reconstruction sessions decades earlier and then disappeared into civilian obscurity. Selak swore him in. Rowe's voice shook at first but steadied as he spoke. He did not deny scarcity. He did not deny impossible arithmetic. He described fleets with no fuel, medicine runs cut by blockade, commanders choosing between colony arcs and evacuation lanes, mothers bribing clerks for route placement, and entire cargo maps rewritten by reactor failure and piracy. He gave Merrick's what he wanted. He gave the room the old context back. Then Mara asked one question. Commander Rowe, after the war ended, were route-specific denial records still dangerous for operational reasons? Rowe looked at her for a long time. No, he said. The chamber did not breathe. Why? Mara asked. Did they remain softened in public history? Rowe lowered himself onto the witness rail, as if the memory had added weight to his body. Because too many people had built too much on a broad version, he said. Officials, teachers, families of signatories, governments that needed to survive their own shame. At first they said it was temporary. Later they said reopening it would break what little healing existed. Later still there were people in power who had never made the choices themselves, but inherited the habit of protecting those who had. Merrick's closed his eyes again. Rin looked away. Mara asked the final question. Would public verification now dishonor the reality of wartime scarcity? Rowe answered without hesitation. No, it would dishonor the habit of calling concealment mercy. That ended it. Not legally, not procedurally, but in the moral center of the room, it ended there. Selak called for chamber vote. The seizure motion failed by a margin wider than Mara had expected. The neutral custodial transfer motion failed as well. The chamber instead passed, under emergency amendment, suspension of all intervention against Earth's archive, pending negotiation of an independent verification framework based on the conditions Earth had proposed, with modifications to be debated in open plenary over the next 12 days. It was not everything. Framework language could still be weakened. Oversight bodies could still be packed if Earth slept. Merits would not stop. Rin would reappear in committee form, softer and perhaps more effective. The struggle had only changed arenas. But the archive was not taken. The council had not been allowed to rename it. And the public now knew that the thing Earth had guarded was not a buried weapon, but a source chain too dangerous to those who preferred history broad and obedient. When the vote display faded, no applause came. This was not that kind of victory. It was heavier than that. Delegates sat with it. Some looked vindicated. Some looked wounded. Some looked like people who had just realized the order they served was more fragile than they had believed that morning. Selak addressed the chamber one final time. Let the record show, he said, that this body does not conclude the post-war order illegitimate. It concludes only that source verification now outranks summary comfort. He glanced toward Mara when he said comfort, a small concession to the truth she had forced into his mouth. The hearing adjourned. Press drones swarmed the outer glass. Security fields rose. Delegates broke into urgent clusters. Harmonization officials disappeared into protected corridors. Smaller world representatives moved at once toward Earth's rail, not in celebration, but in hunger. They wanted standing, access, names, answers, proof. Rin approached alone. Up close, she looked older than she had from the center tier. You won today? She said. No, Maradi Plaiv. Today only stopped the wrong people from winning. Rin absorbed that without protest. You think I am one of them? I think, Mara said, that you grew used to calling postponement wisdom. Hey, exhale. Perhaps. Or perhaps I watched too many settlements collapse after perfect truths arrived with perfect timing. Mara did not dismiss that either. Then help build a process that can survive truth. Rin looked past her toward the darkened screens where the archive shell had floated. If that process destabilizes 3 border packs and 6 compensation regimes, people will blame Earth. They were already going to blame Earth, Mara said. That, at least, made Rin smile faintly. Yes, probably. She left before the conversation could become friendship. The chamber emptied slowly. Mara remained at the lectern longer than she needed to, watching clerks dismantle the hearing grids. The great room looked less like an engine now and more like what it really was, a place where polished species came to arrange the acceptable shape of memory. Commander Rowe passed near her on his way out and stopped. You did the hard part, he said. Mara shook her head. No, I opened the door. He nodded, as if that was what he had meant all along. Be careful, then. Once the dead start speaking in paperwork, the living do strange things. He moved on. At last, Mara left the chamber through the lower corridor reserved for delegations under security watch. Through the reinforced glass, heliospine stretched in arcs of transit light and distant docking traffic. Civil life continued. Cargo moved. Passengers argued. Children probably complained somewhere about station food, school rotation, or the wrong gravity shoes. Civilization always looked ordinary from inside the frame built to protect it. Her private wrist display flashed with incoming notices, standing petitions, interview demands, descendant council requests, threat assessments, market impact alerts, emergency, scheduling for the new verification process, Earth Command asking for preliminary political damage estimates. Beneath all of them sat one line from the archive core system itself, routed through continuity protocol. Custody intact. Mara stopped walking for one heartbeat. All morning, that had been the most practical goal. Keep custody. Prevent seizure. Protect chain. Now the phrase meant something else too. Not ownership. Responsibility. She resumed walking. At the far end of the corridor, a transparent wall opened onto the station's inner curve. Beyond it, the stars looked indifferent, as they always did. Somewhere among them were the descendant worlds whose dead had been softened into dispersal, instability, regrettable transition, complex loss event. Every broad phrase power preferred when precision became dangerous. Not anymore, Mara thought. Not without a fight. Earth had not walked into the council chamber with the largest fleet. It had not threatened blockade or retaliation. It had not crushed the institution across from it. It had done something the council had considered less likely. It had refused a hand over the last intact chain of memory to the people most practiced at making memory easier to live with. That refusal had changed the balance of the room. Behind her, in the hall she had left, the old order was already adapting. It would learn new language. It would draft narrower objections. It would present caution as reason and reason as kindness. It would try again, not always with seizure and not always with force, but with procedure, fatigue, and negotiated dilution. Mara knew that. She had lived too long among archives not to know how power survived exposure. It survived by editing tomorrow. So tomorrow, Earth would have to be there too. Not as conqueror, not as martyr, not as priest of purity, as custodian, as witness, as the species stubborn enough to keep the chain unbroken until the room was finally forced to read what had always been there. By the time she reached the delegation lift, the public station feeds were already changing language. She saw it on a passing civic panel as headlines rolled in multiple scripts. Council suspends seizure effort. Human archive at center of verification fight. Hidden war, cache, claim challenged. Descendant worlds demand review. History offices under scrutiny. The lift doors opened. Jonah and the rest of Earth's team waited inside. No one spoke as Mara entered. They looked exhausted, shocked, and sharpened all at once. The look people wore when they understood they had survived the first collision and were now committed to the road that followed it. As the lift descended toward the secured diplomatic decks, Mara finally allowed herself the smallest release of tension in her shoulders. Earth had kept the archive. The chamber had heard enough to know why it mattered. And the story the council had planned to tell that morning could no longer survive in its clean original form. Somewhere beneath Antarctic stone, in cold vaults built to outlast sentiment, the dead waited with patience no government could outvote. And that was the day the council learned a hard truth about humanity. We are not the loudest voice in the chamber. We are not always the strongest hand in the room. But when the weight of history is bent, buried, or rewritten, humanity endures long enough to set it straight. Mara Veyn did not win with firepower. She won with memory, restraint, and the kind of courage that refuses to let the dead be erased for the comfort of the living. In the end, Earth did not ask for mercy. It demanded honesty. And maybe there was always the deeper strength of humanity. Not its ships, not its weapons, not its power, but its refusal to let truth die in silence. Mara Veyn walked away without celebration, without comfort, and without certainty. But she walked away having saved the one thing no empire should ever be allowed to own: the truth. If you felt the weight of this story, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful science fiction stories that stay with you long after the final word.